This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply located in Dayton, Ohio, exclusive distributor of Jen Allen templates and Put a Lid on It t-shirts. We are a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network. Find all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs, including the largest stock of GR pottery forms at cornellstudiosupply.com. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters, by potters.
The 2024 Michiana Pottery Tour will take place across 10 locations in northern Indiana and southwest Michigan on Saturday, September 28th and Sunday, September 29th. The Michiana Pottery Tour includes more than 50 artists at multiple locations around the region. This two-day tour is a program of the Northern Indiana Clay Alliance, with an interest in promoting the Michiana region as a hub for contemporary ceramics. Learn more at michianapotterytour.com.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 522 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, we have something a little bit different. We're going to have both an interview and an excerpt from a podcast. Today, I'm talking to Camille Dungy, who is an award-winning poet, writer, and host of the podcast Immaterial, 5,000 Years of Art, One Material at a Time, that's produced from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In our interview, we talk about Immaterial and their approach to art and storytelling. We also talk about Camille's passion for gardening and her most recent book, Soil, The Story of a Black Mother's Garden. After our ad break, we're going to feature an excerpt from the Immaterial episode called Stone, Making and Breaking Legacies. If you'd like to hear the rest of that episode, you can follow and subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Many thanks to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for sponsoring this episode of this podcast and for doing the good work that they do producing their podcasts. I did want to mention that my upcoming book, The Complete Guide to Low-Fire Glazes for Potters and Sculptors, has its official release next week, September the 10th. It's now available for pre-order, and you can get your copy today at Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, we're here today to talk about Immaterial, which right now is the number one podcast in the United States for visual arts. Did you know that?
I knew that, and it makes me very, very happy that the podcast is reaching people.
Oh, it's so good. I mean, you guys do such a good job with production. Everything about the way you present the content is really accessible. So I'm honored that we could talk today.
I'm happy to do it.
So how did you get involved with the project?
Actually, honestly, the answer to that remains a bit of a mystery to me, but I knew that the Met team and the production company, which is called Magnificent Noise, were looking for a host, an audio host, who would also have some role in shaping the scripts. And they wanted a poet because I guess we're good with ideas about communication and compression simultaneously. And so my name luckily entered into the conversation, and I honestly thought that the first solicitation was like a spam, but it, because it had everything I loved in it. But because it had everything that I loved in it, I was like, well, if this is, I'm hooked. I'm like, here we go. And so it has been such a cool adventure to follow along and be part of.
Is your writing experience immersive in the same way that making objects is immersive? Because a lot of the podcast is breaking down materials in the Met and the art objects that go with those materials. So how does that relate to your own creative process?
And I think the other thing about Immaterial is that it always jumps off of those materials and those objects and into questions of culture and the human heart. And so those things feel so integral to art making. It can never just be the materials, and it can never just be the order in which you apply the materials. There has to be something about culture and personhood and intention and accident of time and place that shifts and makes that ineffable thing that becomes art. And so being able to work with all of these curators and conservators and scholars and artists who think about these things has opened up a lot of pathways for me as a writer and thinker.
We're going to come back to the podcast, but I wanted to ask questions about your last book, Soil, which was really well received, and congrats on that. Can you just describe what the book is and your perspective on gardening and soil?
Yeah, the short answer is the book is a book-length narrative that explores my 7 years of my family's journey to diversify our landscape, starting in our own yard and thinking about using native plants wherever possible to encourage local pollinators and support this ecology. But that process very quickly revealed questions of human diversity as well as plant diversity and what it means to be a Black family living in a predominantly white state, and history and of connection and care. That was supposed to be the short answer, but it got long.
That's great. Well, when I was reading about the book, one of the descriptions talked about how Fort Collins, where you're at, that there were actual laws or restrictions on what people could put in their own yards or gardens. So can you talk more about that? Because I'm not familiar with that, that type of town control.
That happens a lot of places in America, either town covenants or local homeowners association covenants or neighborhood rules about what you can plant and how tall things can grow, and sometimes color scheme, and sometimes even really specific plant choices. In the best case scenario, this is about stopping invasive species or making sure that there's a kind of sense of community continuity that goes. In the worst senses, it is a kind of monotone control that is often linked with other ideas of propriety and who is and is not good enough, and what is and is not good enough to be in certain places. So these are can frequently be exclusionary codes that come right along with covenants that decide whether Black people or Jewish people or Asian or Latinx people are allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. And so in the worst versions of these codes, there is really brutal exclusion that comes into play.
So, when you wanted to diversify your own yard, was this a mini revolution? were you were you thinking about this as claiming space and power?
Yes, I was. And I also knew I was right. As often is the case for many revolutions, right? Like I understood that the codes that existed when I moved in to our house about what could and couldn't be planted and how tall it could grow, et cetera, were outdated and wrong for the world. And so I started small and figured that by the time I had the time and finances to do the whole yard, the community would have caught up to me and understood that my choices were right. I was correct about that. Um, I live in the West, and the American West is always worried about water. And we are growing more concerned about pollinators and other native species. And so our town has actually created all kinds of incentives, actually, for gardens that look like mine that use more native plants, and which are often these same native plants that are now being encouraged are also on weed categories, right? So they're listed as weeds because they're in direct conflict with a lot of capital choices. If you're in rangeland, if you're trying to grow monoculture crops, you don't want these plants. But if you're trying to encourage native pollinators and things like this, then you do. And so these are two cultural philosophies or ethics that are at odds with each other. And I just chose to align myself with the ethic that feels most sustainable and proactive towards building a safer and better world for the future.
And I think sustainability and diversity go hand in hand. Like that's why monocultures and especially like big agriculture, it just doesn't really make sense.
I mean, for the short term, it makes sense for feeding a lot of people, but there's not much on the planetary scale where a short term, something that makes sense on the short term also makes sense on the long term.
Well, I was listening to an interview that you did on the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, which was a while back, but it was a great interview. I encourage people to listen to it. And you were talking about gardening in general. But you had said that a garden can be a balm, a garden can be a place of rest and beauty, but a garden also teaches me patience, and that the work of a politically engaged person often requires true patience, and that garden supports the belief that patience can very frequently pay off. So can you talk about this idea of what a garden has taught you as a political person, as a creative person, and what you've learned as a human from gardening?
Yeah, I'd love to. People should listen to that podcast. Those guys are like the car talk guys for plants. They're just funny and sweet and fun to talk to and super smart. When I was listening to you just now repeating my words, I didn't hear BALM at first. I heard BOMB, which is another way that I think the gardens can be, right? Gardens can be like bombs. Like we can come in with all kinds of chemicals and just kill everything so that we get the one thing that we want, right? So that we just can support this one particular plant or something, and just distribute a bunch of biocides against everything else. And that's the short-term fix, right? To get a really specific kind of beauty. The longer term kind of fix, that is where I have had to learn patience, and where that learned patience has been deeply rewarded means that I have to go in and hand weed selectively, not using really, really lethal sprayed herbicides. And I have to figure out which flying insect creatures are um, uh, useful and positive for the garden, which are deleterious only if they are in too large of a number, and how I can create a kind of balance. It takes much more time, much more care, much more research, much more patience to be able to do that kind of management without the BOMB bombing strategy of taking care of everything. And yet I can walk out into my garden and eat anything I want whenever I want, because I don't have to worry about whether or not there's biocides that'll be harmful to me on it. I see all kinds of insects that I have never seen before. I just the like bounty of life that is present in my little bit of space is so exciting and fascinating. I was on the phone with a relative the other day sitting in the backyard, and this is somebody who lives nearby, and was like just marveling about how many birds she was hearing coming through my phone, that they were just flitting around the yard, and they're not at her yard because she doesn't have that same kind of control, because she lives in a place where other people are making the decisions about bombing her space. And so the birds aren't hanging out there in the same kinds of ways they're hanging out where I am. And so look at that reward. It does mean that it requires more time from me in many ways, but I am so appreciative of the payback for that care.
So much of gardening, and you even mentioned this, a lot of what you're growing can be classified as a weed, depending on the cultural perspective of who's looking at it. But I think so much of gardening is tending. It's pulling weeds, encouraging things to grow that you want to grow. And I think the creative process is also that, like learning maybe how to pull a bad idea out of rotation. At least for me as a potter, it's, maybe pulling a bad form out of rotation and focusing on something else. So how do you tend your own creativity as a writer?
And Ben, sometimes it's not just so simple as pulling the bad form as learning why the form is not working the way you were asking it to work. And how can you shift it to something that does become more productive and fruitful and have. So that to me is one of the big lessons. Is there's a grasshopper infestation going on where we are this summer. There's grasshoppers everywhere, and a lot of people are really complaining about the grasshoppers. And there are grasshoppers everywhere in my yard, but I'm not finding that they're destroying things. And I think it's because I have so many things, right? Like, I just feel like the bounty that I have created has made it that everybody can be happy, grasshoppers and me. And that as an artist feels really important, learning to trust that the answer isn't always cutting, destroying, getting rid of. Sometimes it's just altering or adding to until you see what it is that the path that you need to follow.
Yeah, and I've known a lot of artists that, there's this almost like common wisdom that you keep the really good pots or paintings because one day way down the line you might have a retrospective. But this teacher I heard was talking about is no, actually you live with the ones that aren't as good. You know, you live with the ones that maybe you need to understand, as you're mentioning. You need to know why. Like, why do I have such a strong preference for one and not the other? And gardening is so much that. Like, I grew up in the South where kudzu is prevalent. And once kudzu comes into an area, some people see it as a nuisance, but I started to see it as beauty because it is so overwhelming. It is abundance itself. So I think I like your perspective that it's almost how you're looking at good and bad is a part of the creative process itself.
And can it also partially be how we're using things so that so much of art is about aesthetics, and so much of aesthetics is trained, consciously or not consciously, right? We're just taught and we learn that this is beautiful and that is not. And this should be done in this way, and that should be used in that way. I'm thinking about the Immaterial podcast, and like we have a whole episode on chia seeds, and it's, to me, it's just like fascinating in terms of like just assumptions about what the binder is for oil paint, and how those assumptions are based on a particular aesthetic that has a particular kind of cultural value, and how it might leave out other realities, right? So with the kudzu, for instance, apparently kudzu is edible.
Mm-hmm.
I follow this woman called the Black Forager who teaches me so much. And so apparently kudzu is edible. And so like, if you were to look out on a kudzu laden landscape, might you actually be seeing nutritional value? If you look at something in a different way, I certainly do that now that I've done a lot more research into native foodways. So many of the native plants that I'm growing here, I don't have much of a Mediterranean European garden here for the things that we typically consider food, but I have a lot of food in my yard. There is a ton of food if I know what I'm seeing and how I'm seeing it and how to prepare it. How frequently does that happen in art? That if we're just allowing ourselves to look at something through one lens, we miss all these other opportunities. And so in one of my poetry collections called Trophic Cascade, which I published in 2017, there are 2 poems in that I must have written in like 2002, 2003, and they just were there. I liked them, but they never quite worked. I always thought there was something wrong with them. There was never anything wrong with them. They just hadn't found their kin. And then I wrote the poems that went in Trophic Cascade, and I remembered these poems, and I realized that they had been waiting for the right community. And then they were fine. They had no revisions. I didn't do anything to them. I just put them with different poems. That too feels like about learning how to see differently, which is also another way of thinking about diversity, right? Like understanding that our limits on who, what, and how things show up in a space limit our possibilities for really exciting proliferations.
I was thinking about the museum and museum practices while you were talking about that. The connection I was making in my head is that some materials are seen as almost useless. So clay, for instance, the thing that I've devoted my life to, is seen as like completely cheap and unnecessary if it's a terracotta flower pot. And I think you could say the same as kudzu, as we mentioned before. But if you shift in another direction, you can see terracotta as a really plastic medium that you can make literally anything out of. And you can see kudzu as a food source. And you could see an old poem as maybe something that just needed community to really thrive. I think museums are a space in which this experience of shifting perspective often happens for me. And I think what I like about Immaterial as a podcast is it's often making me think very different about Chia, as you mentioned, or about linen, or about stone, which is the episode we're going to play after this interview. It's almost like a museum is a place to reframe ideas and give it context.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the other things I love about this show is all the people. Like, you guys went in and you talked to curators that I would never have known about. The stone curator that we're going to hear about in this podcast. Like, they're doing amazing work, but they're kind of in the background of a museum. They're not the forefront. So can you talk about, one, the idea of like museums as a place to redefine context, and then also people as a way to redefine context in the museum itself, like the curators?
Wow. That's a big one, Ben.
Sorry, I'm asking big questions here.
Yeah, and it partially feels big because so much of season 2 of Immaterial, I feel like we are thinking about that idea of museums as spaces for rethinking what we might know about art, but also what we might know about who we are and what we value. And so curators, have such a role in that. What gets put next to what means that I, as the observer off the street, am offered particular value sets, particular histories, particular alignments of thoughts. And if you put A next to B or A next to Z, those tell two very different stories about the alphabet. And that's a curatorial decision, right? And if you put A next to N, then what happens, right? Then how am I like, wait, why did those two letters go together, right? Those first two I listed made a kind of sense, quote unquote. The last one, A next to N, doesn't make sense as the alphabet, but it's a word. Right. And so like, what happens when curators make these decisions of putting things next to each other? And I think at the Met, in recent years in particular, really, really thoughtful care has gone into what goes with what and what gets revealed as a result. And then, of course, there's just the architecture of a museum like the Met, which is really a billion museums in one. It's something like 5 city, but like it's an enormous space. How do you connect those spaces? They're building an entire new wing, and so that one of our episodes we talk about the architect and how the architect is preparing for this momentous task of building a space that is going to then decide the way we are able to receive the art. All of it is so fascinating and collaborative, right? And I think many artists think about this as we're working, right? So if you're a painter, how big is your canvas? And then what kind of frame do you want for that canvas, or do you not want a frame? And like, because that decision is part of the decision about how the art presents itself. Are your ceramic pieces going to be displayed individually or in a cluster? That's like all of these different decisions. Is my poem going to be very short lines? Because I know that so many people read their things on phones anymore, and I don't want it tucked in or down. Or am I going to just take up lots and lots of space? And right, all of those are choices that artists make that have something to do with a knowledge that the person who receives the art receives the art in a world and all of those pressures of the world sort of weigh on them and will make a difference. Is this terracotta pot, was it just an everyday object in a home 3,000 years ago, and it's art now because it's that old? Or was it art then because it was the terracotta pot that was the pot that was going to be sitting in the most important space in the center of your living area for your whole married life? And so you might as well make it beautiful. Right? It's functional, but it's also beautiful. So many of these questions, we thought about these questions throughout the season, or the 2 seasons really, of Immaterial. And I then don't stop thinking about them after we've wrapped an episode.
I know. Isn't that the greatest thing about being a writer and podcaster in this instance, is that you're putting stuff out into the community through the airwaves, but you're really getting enriched. I find this too when I talk to artists. I'm still thinking about conversations I had in the early 2010s where someone just said the right thing, the right words at the right time, and it got into my head, and I haven't been able to get it out or figure out exactly what they were talking about.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, to wrap up, I did want to say Immaterial is in season 2, and it's getting ready to wrap up season 2 somewhat soon here.
I know.
Can you just tell people how they can listen to it? And also, can you leave your own website so people could get in touch if they want to find out more about you?
Absolutely. Immaterial is available anywhere that you get your podcasts. So, of course, as with all podcasts, we would love subscribe, because that just helps people know, and it helps the Met know that you're interested and that I can hop back on for season 3. So yeah, anywhere that you get your podcasts, you can get Immaterial. And if it's easier, you can just go through the Metropolitan Museum of Art podcasts, and Immaterial is one of the podcasts produced out of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And then my website is just my name, Camille Dungy, CamilleDungy, CamilleDungy.com. And that's where you can find me.
Well, thanks so much, Camille. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for chatting with me.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a 2-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
And now we're going to jump right into that excerpt of Immaterial.
There's a writer, Robert McFarlane, who talks about stone in a really fascinating way. Robert is a mountaineer and a nature writer. And there's a passage from his book, Underland, that has been stuck in my head as we've worked on this episode. Before we start, I want to share it with you. We tend to imagine stone as inert matter, obdurate in its fixity. But seen in deep time, stone feels instead like a liquid briefly paused in its flow. Stone folds as strata, gouts as lava, floats as plates, shifts as shingle. And with that, our story begins one late night in New York City.
It was a Sunday night. It was October 6th, 2002.
This is conservator Jack Soltanian. He preserves and repairs art at the Met.
And I had just returned from the movies.
He was about to settle in at his home for the night when his phone rang. Being a conservator isn't like being a surgeon or a firefighter. In 16 years working at the museum, Jack had never received an emergency call on a weekend.
I was told that there was a terrible accident, so naturally I rushed to the museum.
He arrived at the underground security entrance that was led through the museum to a gallery called the Velas Blanco patio. When Jack entered, he was astonished at what he saw.
The scene was truly devastating.
Strewn across the floor of the patio was a body.
It was total grief and horror at the scene.
The body was made of marble. It had been a carefully rendered life-size sculpture of Adam, the one from the Bible. This nude figure appeared simultaneously divine and human. It was considered one of the greatest works of the 15th century, created by one of Italy's most gifted sculptors, Tullio Lombardo.
This great masterpiece of Italian Renaissance sculpture was absolutely, in pieces. And the fragments were scattered everywhere. And at that time, it was unclear what had happened.
Was this the site of a crime or a terrible accident? Was the statue pushed, or did it fall, or did it spontaneously explode? While Jack stood, trying to wrap his head around what had happened, he heard a horrifying crunching sound right behind him.
The security officer who brought me up, who had all good intentions, kept walking in the patio floor, and I can still hear the sound of the fragments crushing under his shoes. And so I told him very politely to, please stop, which he did. And then I cordoned off. I said that no one was allowed into the patio.
Jack was in a daze, but he knew in this moment on a Sunday night there wasn't much he could do. The damage was done. So, for the second time that night, he went home.
When I woke on Monday morning, it was the first time I had ever thought, no, this was a dream or a nightmare, that this did not really happen.
But it did really happen. And when Jack arrived back at the museum, he had to get to work. He called fellow conservator Carolyn Riccardelli, who had just completed grad school and had recently started a job at the museum.
I remember it very clearly. I got the phone call, and it was my colleague, Jack Soltanian, and he said there's been an incident. And I went upstairs and I saw this sculpture broken all over the floor, and it was devastating. Like it had a visceral, physical reaction to it, an emotional reaction that I still feel, even now talking about it. I didn't know what the work of art was because I was unfamiliar with Adam. And I asked him, what is this? What fell down? And he said, it's Adam by Tullio Lombardo. And I kind of shrugged my shoulders, and he said, it's the most important Renaissance sculpture in the Western Hemisphere. And that really hit me. I couldn't believe it. And then, I had to click into, all right, what are we going to do next? Like, what are we going to do about this?
From the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I'm poet and writer Camille Dungy, and this is Immaterial. This episode, Stone. The stories Stone carries.
Look at the spells they cast, the crimes they incite.
There's some kind of life force that this sculpture has.
And what it means when stone breaks.
When you damage a statue, you could also damage the individual.
It was bad. It was a big mistake.
Those pieces on the floor of the Velas Blanco patio are no stranger to fragmentation. Before the sculpture shattered on the floor, it was a stone slab, chiseled and chipped in an artist's studio. And before that, it was hacked from the side of a mountain. Stone sculptures are formed through successive subtractions, forged through breaking, bit by bit. So it makes sense that to understand what it means for a stone sculpture to break, we have to look back at why artists choose to carve stone in the first place. This is not a choice that artists make lightly. Stone is heavy, almost immovable. So why use it? I promise I'll get back to Adam's story, but for now, I want to introduce you to a guy in ancient Mesopotamia who used stone in the stoniest way possible. Gudea was a powerful ruler in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest recorded civilizations in the world.
We're looking at about 4,000 years ago, southern Iraq, kind of just branching off the Tigris River.
That's Met curator Sarah Graff. We met in her office where she just finished a cranberry scone.
Yeah, it was really good. And I can't believe it's still around because I bought it on Sunday. How did it survive till Wednesday? Who knows, but it was good. And I was like, thanks, past self, for thinking of future self.
Okay, that's beside the point. But actually, kind of not. Like Sarah, the Mesopotamian ruler Gudea thought a lot about his future self. Specifically, Gudea was thinking of himself in the afterlife. In ancient Mesopotamia, after you died,
you depend on your descendants to remember you so that you're not in the afterlife hungry and thirsty and alone and forgotten.
They were supposed to leave food and water and other meaningful offerings at your grave. Being the powerful ruler that he was, Gudea wanted to be remembered and tended to, not just for a couple of generations, but forever. But he wondered,
how do I communicate with somebody that I can't imagine? How do I make sure that they know this really important piece of information?
How do I tell people who will never meet me, who will live far into the future, that I mattered? Gudea commissioned a nearly indestructible tribute, a group of sculptures of himself. And he was very particular about what material they would be made of. A dark, smooth stone known to be practically unbreakable, diorite.
He didn't want them made in precious metals and ivory. He wanted them made in diorite because diorite's a very hard stone. It's a permanent kind of image. It would stand for eternity.
To get his hands on diorite, Gudea likely sent an expedition hundreds of miles away to where the stone was mined in present-day Oman. Then, he ordered the construction of a series of diorite sculptures of himself to be placed in temples throughout the city. One record said there were 500 sculptures. And inscribed on at least one of the sculptures was a phrase.
Let the life of Gudea, who built the house, be long. His life is long because we still know his name 4,000 years after he died. We know who he is. We know what he did. So in a really concrete sense, his life has been long because of the medium that he chose for preserving his accomplishments. And his life continues.
And today, 4,000 years later, one of Gudea's statues sits in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, seated, hands folded over each other in front of his chest like a confident boss. Gudea doesn't look a day over 500.
He has beautiful fingernails and toenails, and you can see his cuticles, which is extraordinary.
Imagine one of Gudea's sculptures as a sped-up time lapse moving a century a second. Over the years, the sculpture's surrounding environment shifts. The city around it is built up and broken down. The sculpture is remembered, forgotten, worshipped, discarded, and then remembered again. But at the end of it all, the diorite sculpture still stands, cuticles and all, almost outside of time. Stone declares its own importance, its own power, and for no other reason than that it is still here. So back to Tullio Lombardo's Adam, that marble sculpture that shattered into hundreds of pieces on the museum floor. Marble was the diorite of the Italian Renaissance. It was the type of material out of which rulers and religious leaders wanted their monuments carved. They chose marble as their medium to scream, "This is important," through the void of time and into the future. Adam was definitely a "this is important" psychic scream. A successful one at that. That's thanks to the sheer genius of the guy who carved his name on the base of the statue. The artist himself, Tullio Lombardo. In the early Renaissance, Tullio Lombardo was known as one of the greatest sculptors of all time. To Carolyn Riccardelli, the conservator who encountered Adam shattered on the floor, Tullio's work exuded something difficult to place your finger on.
There's some kind of life force that this sculpture has. I mean, I always felt it because it looked realistic and alive, even as individual fragments. There were moments where I was like, oh, is it real?
At the time that Tullio Lombardo made this sculpture, he was in his early 30s, and he was eager to prove himself. So when the Doge of Venice called upon Tullio's family workshop to construct a whole church monument in his honor, Tullio must have been excited to take the lead. For his show-stopping piece in the multi-part monument, Tullio hatched a plan to sculpt an incredibly lifelike version of Adam, the perfect man, created by God and in God's image, in marble. And he wouldn't sculpt Adam out of just any marble. He would use Carrara marble, a perfect stony cocktail mixed and fermented over millions of years. Seen over deep time, stones like marble are almost liquid, which might come as a surprise. It definitely did to writer Robert Macfarlane.
I grew up as a mountaineer. I'm still a mountaineer. And, mountaineers really prize the solidity of rock. It's kind of what you hang on and what you hang off. But I remember some of those gong strike moments when you begin to realize that you're dealing with a substance that has its own, fantastical age, its own extraordinary biographies. You realize that stone has other identities too. And some of those are liquid and some of those are somewhere between liquid and solid.
Carrara marble is one of those extraordinary malleable stones. It started as the skeletons of ancient sea creatures compressed at the bottom of the ocean. When tectonic plates shifted, the fossilized mass metamorphosed and slowly rose up 6,000 feet to form the Apuan Alps in Carrara, Italy. It's these kinds of ancient histories that clue you into stone's mobility, or as Robert puts it,
the symphony of the earth, the way that mountains rise and fall, they dilapidate.
Most marble becomes discolored or streaked over time as it melds with other minerals, but by some strange accident, some Carrara marble remains perfectly crystalline and translucent. It glows. From ancient times, humans were obsessed with Carrara marble. They went through immense effort to wrench this heavy material from the side of a mountain and lug it hundreds of miles away. Tullio Lombardo's Adam was a work of art worthy of Carrara marble. Tullio received a 6-foot, 3-inch block of marble, and he had one chance to carve his perfect human body. The process of carving is quite unforgiving.
It's a subtractive process. Once you remove stone by carving it, you can't put it back on. Once it's gone, it's gone. So if you make a mistake at the top of the sculpture, you would continue carving until you corrected that mistake.
Tullio Lombardo couldn't make a single mistake. And he didn't.
To me, that's just very impressive and shows like a command of the material, like a confidence and skill that kind of blows my mind.
Tullio completed the 20 sculpture monument for the Doge of Venice with the help of assistants, but he chose to carve his signature only on Adam. It was an assertion of his authorship, an acknowledgement of his great work. And maybe this carved signature would communicate his skill to people hundreds of years into the future. His masterpiece was actively and carefully protected for more than 500 years. It eventually made its way to the Met, where it stood on a pedestal in a gallery intact and whole, until the worst thing that could happen happened. The sculpture fell. I have questions about this. What actually happened? Why did Adam fall?
Adam was on a pedestal. The reason the sculpture fell down is because the pedestal collapsed. It buckled under the weight of the sculpture and it fell apart, and Adam went down with the pedestal. What I know is that the pedestal was built about 2 years before the accident, so it really wasn't a very old pedestal. There was some work done in the Velas Blanco patio, and at that time, they redid the pedestals. And they were built by an outside contractor. Clearly, this one wasn't built properly. It wasn't built for something this heavy. And even if it's not something I ever directly had any conversations about, you still feel responsible. This was a really special work of art, and it was under our watch. I mean, I still get choked up thinking about those moments. And there are times I give talks about the sculpture, and there's a moment where I show pictures of the broken fragments on the floor. And it's a palpable reaction from the audience every time. And then I feel that, and I get choked up. And I've done it many times and over. And here, even now, sitting here, I still have that emotional reaction. It was bad. It was bad. It was a big mistake. And that reaction drove our decision-making and the way that we approached it. We wanted to make up for the accident and get as much out of it as we could.
Met conservators Jack and Carolyn were given a day and a half to collect all the fragments of Tullio Lombardo's Adam. This was 28 large pieces and hundreds of tiny shards spread across the marble floor of the Velas Blanco patio. How did they even conceptualize a way to clean up the mess? They did what they knew. They tried to make order out of chaos.
So what we did is we literally gridded the floor. Every tile that had even the tiniest fragment of the marble was given a code number according to its coordinates and was photographed.
Once they gathered every fragment, big and small, the team laid them out on tables in their studio, wondering, but not knowing, what would come next.
But I immediately thought of who's going to deal with this? Who's going to put this back together? Not like, how are we going to explain that we have to trash the sculpture? In other words, I always went straight to somebody's going to put this piece back together. It's going to be a big, giant job, and who's going to do that? And it turned out to be me.
I'd like to thank Camille for coming on the show, and I hope you enjoyed that abbreviated episode of Immaterial called Stone Making and Breaking Legacies. If you'd like to check out the rest of that, you can follow them on your favorite podcast app. Just look for Immaterial 5,000 Years of Art, one material at a time. Again, that's Immaterial 5,000 Years of Art, one material at a time. I'd like to thank the Metropolitan Museum of Art for sponsoring this episode, along with our other sponsors, the Michiana Pottery Tour, the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and Bray Clay. If you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.